Life stories. The truth hurts. How a quiet student took down the school bully with one move. At 5'10", Eli wasn't exactly small for a 16-year-old. He had a lean, athletic build that came from years of training, not just lifting weights, but real discipline. He moved with the quiet confidence his father had instilled in him. Measured steps, back straight, never slouching. But to them, he was still the outsider. He made his way to the front office without any issues and got his class schedule from the overly friendly receptionist. As he walked out, a group of students near the lockers caught his eye. A tall, broad-shouldered guy with messy brown hair was leaning against the lockers, flanked by two others. They were laughing at something he had just said, the kind of laugh meant to be overheard, just loud enough so that the target would hear. Eli wasn't the target, not yet, but it didn't take a genius to recognize that feeling, the subtle tension, the way people sized him up. The guy's name was Jake Reynolds, according to the class roster Eli had glanced out earlier. Jake's look wasn't hostile exactly, but it wasn't welcoming either. It was the look of someone trying to decide if they should make you a problem. Eli had seen it before. Jake smirked, leaned towards one of his friends, and muttered something that made the others laugh again. Eli exhaled slowly, walking past them with purpose. He had nothing to prove. His dad's voice echoed in his head like it always did. Strength isn't about showing off. It's about knowing when to walk away. So Eli walked away. But Jake? Guys like Jake don't like being ignored. By the end of the week, Eli had already learned how things worked at Willowbrook. There was an unspoken order, a hierarchy that didn't need to be explained. The athletes ruled the school. The rich kids were treated like royalty. And everyone else? They just existed. No one stood out too much. Eli didn't fit in any of those categories. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he wasn't afraid of it either, and that made him stand out. Jake Reynolds and his friends? They thrived on easy targets. Kids who shrank away when they were insulted, who laughed nervously when they were pushed around. Kids who didn't know how to respond. Eli wasn't one of those kids, and Jake was determined to make him one. At first, it started small. A casual shoulder bump in the hallway. "Watch where you're going," muttered just loud enough for Eli to hear. Then came the more deliberate taunts. In history class, Jake knocked Eli's notebook off his desk, flashing that smirk afterward, as if he were testing Eli, waiting for a reaction. Eli gave him nothing. Then came the comments. "Didn't know they let kids like you in here, Thomas. You think you're gonna try out for football? I mean, you people are good at that, right? Man, you're quiet. Thought you guys were supposed to be funny." Jake never said it outright in front of a teacher. It was always just loud enough so that a teacher might dismiss it as a joke, just subtle enough that Jake could act innocent if anyone called him out. And the others? They laughed. Not all of them, but enough of them. Enough to make Eli's hands ball into fists under the desk. He thought about telling his dad, but he already knew what the response would be. Handle it with discipline, don't stoop to their level. And his mom? She'd want him to talk to a teacher, but Eli knew that wouldn't help either. Willowbrook wasn't going to punish one of its star athletes over something they couldn't directly prove. So Eli handled it the way he always had, by ignoring it. At least that was the plan, until one moment changed everything. It was Friday during lunch, and Eli had just sat down with his tray when a shadow fell over his table. He looked up to find Jake standing behind him, flanked by his usual crew, Zach and Brandon. Jake grinned, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Man, I've been wondering, why don't you talk much, Thomas? What, did a cat get your tongue?" Eli didn't respond. He just took a bite of his food and chewed slowly, unfazed. That answer didn't satisfy Jake. In a flash, he grabbed an apple off Eli's tray and tossed it across the cafeteria. It landed with a dull thud near the drink station. A few heads turned, eyes waiting to see how Eli would react. Eli set his fork down slowly, deliberately, and looked up at Jake for the first time that week. Jake smiled, mistaking Eli's silence for fear, and that's when he made his biggest mistake. He shoved Eli's shoulder hard, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Come on, Thomas, do something." The entire cafeteria froze. Conversation stopped. Even the lunch staff paused behind the counter, watching from a distance. Jake Reynolds had just shoved Eli Thomas in front of everyone, and now all eyes were on Eli, waiting to see what he'd do. Eli sat still for a moment, his mind already processing the situation. His dad's words echoed in his head. "You don't fight with anger, you fight with control." Slowly, Eli pushed his chair back, stood up, and stepped away from the table. He wasn't rushing, no panic. His movements were calm and precise, like a man stretching before a workout. Jake's smirk widened. "Oh, we got a tough guy," he said to his friends. "You gonna swing, Thomas? You gonna act like a thug now?" Eli's expression didn't change. He just tilted his head slightly, studying Jake as if he were trying to solve an equation that didn't quite add up. That was the moment Jake realized something was off. Eli wasn't nervous. He wasn't flinching. He wasn't even blinking. For just a fraction of a second, Jake hesitated. There was a shift in his posture, a primal instinct kicking in, telling him that maybe, just maybe, he had made a mistake. But it was too late. Jake reached out again, shoving Eli, this time with more force, as if trying to provoke him into a reaction. But Eli was faster. Before Jake's hands could even fully extend, Eli's left hand shot up, locking around Jake's wrist in a seamless motion. His right hand followed, snapping onto Jake's elbow in a smooth, controlled grip. With barely any effort, Eli pivoted slightly, using Jake's own momentum against him. In an instant, Jake was off the ground, his back slamming against the cafeteria floor with a sickening thud. The entire room fell into a stunned silence. For a moment, no one knew what to say or do. Jake gasped, his eyes wide in disbelief as he lay sprawled on the cold tile, his body momentarily frozen in shock. His friends, Zach and Brandon, took a step forward, but Eli didn't even glance at them. Instead, Eli crouched down next to Jake, his voice low and steady. "Don't touch me again." There were no threats, no insults, just a simple statement, and that was what made it so much worse. Eli hadn't just beaten Jake, he had dismissed him, like he was nothing. Eli stood up without a second glance at Jake or his friends, dusted his hands off casually as though he'd just moved a chair, and picked up his tray. He didn't look back as he walked out of the cafeteria, the air still thick with tension, the silence oppressive. The whispers started almost immediately. Students stared at each other, unsure how to react, unsure what to make of what they had just witnessed. Then, from the back of the room, a voice whispered, "Holy shit!" And that was all it took. The floodgates opened. Whispers turned into murmurs. Murmurs turned into excited chatter. Phones were out, people were texting, and the rumors spread like wildfire. Jake remained seated on the floor, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into tight fists. He knew the moment the bell rang and everyone went home that he wouldn't be able to avoid the truth. By the end of the day, everyone in Willowbrook would know exactly what had happened. But this wasn't over. By the time the final bell rang, the story of Eli Thomas taking down Jake Reynolds had already spread across the entire school. It wasn't just the fight that people were talking about, it was the way Eli had handled it. Not with a wild punch or a messy brawl, but with one clean, effortless move. That's what made it so unforgettable. Eli had made Jake look weak, helpless, and at a school like Willowbrook, that wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. Eli walked out of the building, ignoring the stares. Some kids watched him like they were seeing him for the first time. Others whispered, and a few even looked nervous. Ryan was nowhere in sight. That would have been too obvious. But Eli wasn't naive. He knew how this worked. Guys like Jake, people who had been publicly humiliated, didn't just let it go. They plotted, they waited, and when the time was right, they would make sure their revenge was worth it. At home, Eli barely made it through dinner before his mom noticed. She had that look, the way she tilted her head when she was scanning his face for something more than just a simple fine. "Everything okay at school?" she asked, setting down her fork. Eli shrugged. "Yeah, just a regular day." His mom wasn't buying it. She studied him for a long moment, but his dad didn't look up from his plate. His dad never asked questions. He waited for answers, but not right then. His mom, on the other hand, was already on alert. Later that evening, Eli's phone buzzed. He looked down at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. "You think you're tough? You got lucky today. Watch your back." Eli stared at the message for a moment, then exhaled. He locked his phone, placed it face down on his desk, and leaned back at his chair. It wasn't surprising. In fact, it was exactly what he had expected. But now, he had a choice to make. Would he ignore it and pretend like nothing happened? Or would he make sure Jake and everyone else understood exactly who Eli Thomas was? Monday morning felt different from the moment Eli stepped foot in Willowbrook. There was a shift in the air. The sideways glances, the hushed conversations that would stop when he walked past, it was all the confirmation he needed. The story had already grown legs, and by the time he reached his locker, 2 freshmen darted out of his way. A junior he didn't even know gave him a respectful nod, and then, suddenly, they wanted to be his friend. "Yo, Thomas, you really dropped Jake, huh? Dude, I heard you barely even touched him. He just dropped like a sack of bricks. Man, you got hands like that and you don't even talk? That's cold." Eli ignored them, offering nothing more than a glance or a short nod. It wasn't respect they were showing him, it was entertainment. They weren't seeing him as a person, they were seeing him as a spectacle, as a rumor come to life. That's when Eli saw Jake. He was standing by his usual spot near the main entrance, but something was different. The cocky smirk was gone. The easy confidence was missing. Instead, Jake stood stiff, his fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't alone, of course. Zach and Brandon were flanking him, as always, but now they weren't laughing. They weren't making jokes. Jake met Eli's gaze for half a second, then quickly looked away. Eli almost smirked. Almost. But he knew better than to think Jake had given up. Guys like Jake didn't just accept a loss. They waited. They plotted. They made sure that when they got their revenge, it was going to be worth it. Lunch felt tense, even before Eli sat down. The air was thick with expectation. People were watching him, waiting to see if Jake would come storming across the cafeteria for a round 2. But Jake wasn't there. His usual table was empty. Eli had just started eating when someone sat across from him. It wasn't one of Jake's guys. It was Ava Sinclair. Eli knew her by reputation. Smart, confident, never one to follow the crowd. She set her drink down and studied him for a moment before speaking. "You know," she began, "you didn't just beat Jake, you humiliated him." Eli chewed his food slowly, considering her words, then swallowed. "Yeah, but you ended it. That's worse for him," Ava added with a smirk. Eli didn't respond. Ava leaned forward slightly. "Just be careful. Jake's dad is on the school board. You think he's going to let this slide?" Eli met her gaze, steady, unfazed. "Does it look like I care?" Ava exhaled, shaking her head. "You should." She stood up, grabbing her tray. "Just watch your back." And with that, she walked away. For the first time since Friday, Eli felt something he hadn't before. Not anger, not annoyance, but curiosity. Because whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be another cafeteria fight. By Wednesday, the energy at Willowbrook High had shifted again. Jake wasn't just avoiding Eli, he was actively erasing him from the narrative. No more insults, no more smug glances, no more games, nothing. It was as if the entire school had been placed on a silent, unspoken embargo about Eli. The usual antics had stopped, but instead of feeling victorious, Eli couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something still wasn't right. And then, as if on cue, Ava found him after the last period. She didn't waste any time. "Jake's dad is trying to get you expelled," she said, no preamble. Eli barely reacted. He had known this was coming. "For what?" he asked, though he wasn't really asking. He already knew. Ava scoffed. "They don't need a reason. They're claiming you attacked Jake, that it was unprovoked. He's pulling strings to make it stick." Eli ran a hand over his face, inhaling deeply, trying to keep his frustration in check. It wasn't the first time he had seen this happen. A white student starts something, a black student finishes it, and suddenly the rules don't apply the same way. He knew how the system worked. "So what do I do?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with the kind of seriousness that came from having to grow up fast. Ava hesitated. Then she said it. "Fight back. Not with fists, with proof." Eli didn't need to ask her for details. That night, he got to work. By morning, he had everything. Screenshots of the texts from Jake's phone, a full clip of the cafeteria fight. Someone had recorded the whole thing. And the witnesses? There were a few, including some students who had seen what had happened and were willing to speak up. Eli walked into school the next day, not alone. Ava was with him, as were two other students. Kids he barely knew before this whole thing started, but now they were all on the same side. They knew the truth, and that was enough. They marched straight to the principal's office. Inside, the meeting was tense. Eli sat still, his eyes focused, his jaw set. Jake's father was there too, looking as polished and powerful as any school board member with the ability to pull strings. It was clear what he was trying to do: twist the situation, make it look like Eli was the aggressor. But Eli wasn't worried. He had the evidence. He had the truth. By the time the meeting ended, Jake's father hadn't gotten what he wanted. Eli wasn't expelled. He wasn't suspended. Nothing stuck. Because the truth was on Eli's side, and it was undeniable. Jake didn't come back to school for the rest of the week. When he finally did return, it was clear he wasn't the same. He was quieter, less confident. He kept his head down, his voice lower. He wasn't afraid of Eli, not in the way most people thought, but he understood something now. Eli had beaten him, not just in the cafeteria, but in a way that mattered, in a way that was impossible to ignore. That's when it hit Eli. He never wanted to be in this position. He never asked for respect, and he certainly didn't want to be the center of attention. All he ever wanted was to exist without being tested, without constantly having to prove himself. But the reality was, some people only learn their lesson when it's too late. And sometimes, standing your ground wasn't about throwing punches. It was about making sure the truth was louder than the lies. It was about showing that when the world tries to write your story, you get to be the one to hold the pen. Eli wasn't a spectacle. He wasn't someone to be talked about behind his back. He was a person who deserved the same respect anyone else did. And when that respect wasn't given, he would make sure that everyone understood exactly who he was. He wasn't here for drama. He wasn't here to fight, but he wasn't going to back down either. When the final bell rang that day, Eli walked out of the school, his head held high. The whispers followed him, but this time they weren't about what happened. They were about him, about how he had handled it, how he had won. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Sometimes the toughest battles weren't the ones fought with fists. They were the ones fought with the truth. Lessons learned. The story of Eli at Willowbrook High teaches powerful lessons about standing up for yourself, the importance of control, and the strength in handling conflict with integrity. One key message is that true strength isn't about physical power or reacting in anger. It's about maintaining control and dignity, especially when provoked. Eli's decision to not just fight back with force, but with the truth, shows that real power lies in making sure your actions and character speak louder than false accusations. In life, we often face challenges where we are pushed to prove ourselves, sometimes through unjust circumstances. Whether it's dealing with bullying, discrimination, or being underestimated, responding with calm, confidence, and the courage to stand by what is right can be more powerful than any retaliation. The lesson here is that when the world tries to write your story for you, you have the ability to write your own. It's about knowing when to speak up, when to lock away, and most importantly, knowing that your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you choose to handle yourself. If you found this video helpful or thought-provoking, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. It really helps more people discover our content. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the latest updates from our channel. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next videos.